the watershed. At the end of August 1848, Marx decided on a trip to Berlin and Vienna to meet the democratic leaders there and try to raise funds for the paper. He spent 2 days in Berlin where he saw his old friend Kappen, Bakunin and leaders of the left such as the energetic Dester who represented Cologne in the Prussian Assembly. In Vienna he spent almost 2 weeks. A few days before his arrival, there had been a bloody repression of the workers and the whole city was to pass under democratic control for a short period at the end of October. Marx took part in a meeting of the Democratic Club which, though agreed on demanding the resignation of the government, were debating whether the demand should be made of the emperor or of parliament. Marx is reported as intervening testily to say that emperor and parliament were largely irrelevant here. The greatest power of all has been forgotten, the people. We must turn to the people and influence them with all the means at our disposal, through the press, placards and public meetings. Marx also gave 2 lectures in the Workers' Association, one on the development of the workers' movements in Europe and the other a repeat of his Brussels talks on wage labor and capital. On his return to Berlin he attended a meeting of the Prussian Assembly and succeeded in negotiating a gift of 2,000 thalers from the Polish community who were impressed by the Neue Rheinische Zeitung's defense of their cause. Another 2,000 thalers he managed to collect from other sources, the Hansmann ministry, proving too recalcitrant for the Prussian establishment, had fallen while Marx was in Berlin. The controversial armistice with Denmark also contributed to the general feeling of unrest throughout Germany. Marx hurried back to Cologne on September 11 to experience the most tempestuous month of that turbulent year. Relations in Cologne between the citizens and the soldiers, most of whom came from East Prussia, were tense in any event, and on September 13, after a particularly brutal provocation and looting by the soldiers, Wolf and burghers summoned a public meeting on Cologne's main square. Several thousands surrounded the tribune draped in a black, red, and gold flag. The flysheet with the 17 demands was distributed, and a committee of public safety of 30 members was elected to represent those portions of the population not represented by the present authorities. The committee included Marx and most of the staff of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. Its 5-man executive committee, of which Marx was not a member, was headed by Hermann Becker. The last act of the meeting was to send an address, proposed by Engels, to the Prussian Assembly urging them to stand firm in the face of government pressure. The Committee of Public Safety summoned a mass meeting at Waringen just outside Cologne for the following Sunday, September 17, in order to support the Frankfurt Assembly against the Prussian government over Denmark. It was also hoped that the choice of venue would help to draw into the revolutionary movement peasants and factory workers who lived in the villages. About 10,000 people arrived to hear a series of speeches in favor of a social democratic republic from, among others, one Lenry Brisbane, editor of the New York Daily Tribune, and Lassalle, whose championship of Countess von Hatzfeld in a cause célèbre had already provided him with a national reputation, representing the Düsseldorf radicals. On Engels' proposal a motion was carried that, if a conflict broke out between Prussia and the other German states, the participants would give life and limb for Germany. The news had not yet arrived that the Frankfurt Assembly, which had not even been previously consulted, had reluctantly agreed to the Armistice of Malmö that Prussia had signed with Denmark. This aroused nationwide protests, particularly from Democrats who considered that Prussia had merely dishonored Germany and had rejected all aspirations towards national unity. Barricades were erected in Frankfurt and 2 conservative deputies were lynched. The momentum of protest in Cologne was continued on September 20 with a mass meeting called in support of the Frankfurt insurgents by the Democratic Society and the Workers' Association as well as the Committee of Public Safety. The Neue Rheinische Zeitung opened a subscription for them and their families, but the movement had already passed its zenith. The Frankfurt uprising was suppressed and the king nominated General Pfuel to form an administration that could no longer be called liberal. The Second Congress of the Rhineland Democrats had been called for September 25. But early in the morning of the same day, the authorities struck. Becker and Schapper were arrested, and only the gathering of a hostile crowd gave Moll time to escape. Warrants were also issued for the arrest of Engels, Drunk, Wolf and burghers, the charge in every case being conspiracy to overthrow the regime. Marx himself could not be prosecuted as he had taken no active part in the recent public meetings. A meeting of the Democratic Society that afternoon which Marx attended decided to do everything to avoid a confrontation with the soldiers. Marx wrote 2 weeks later, the Democrats told the workers that under no circumstances did they want a putsch. At this moment, there was no burning question to bring the people as a whole into the struggle, and every revolt must therefore fail. It was even more senseless since in a few days violent events could occur and we would have made ourselves incapable of fighting even before the day of decision. A few barricades were raised, and although these were dismantled without violence, the authorities being thereby deprived of the clash that they had hoped to provoke, martial law was declared that evening. The Civil Guard was disbanded, all political organizations were forbidden, and the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, together with 3 smaller newspapers, was suppressed. Martial law lasted for a week. It was lifted on October 3 on orders from Berlin following pressure from the Cologne City Council and the Prussian Assembly. The Neue Rheinische Zeitung had been hard hit. Marx had planned to bring out the newspaper in Düsseldorf had martial law continued, but even so it was impossible to put an issue together before 13 October. Engels and Dronk had gone to Belgium, Wolff to Pfalz, and Marx and Wirth were the only editors left. One fresh recruit was the poet Ferdinand Freiligrath. Marx had to contribute yet more of his own and Jenny's money to get the paper restarted, and it became legally his own property when it did reappear. The paper was full of reports on Vienna. The city had fallen under the control of the Democrats on October 6, and the emperor had been forced to flee for a second time. He was reinstated at the end of the month by loyalist troops under Prince Windisgratz, who had struck the first blow for the counter-revolution as early as June when he suppressed the rising of the Czechs in Prague. Austria set the example for Prussia. On 2 November General Pfuel was replaced by Count Brandenburg, illegitimate son of Frederick William II and an energetic conservative, and on November 9 the Prussian Assembly was transferred to the small provincial town of Brandenburg. At first it refused to move and had to be hounded ignominiously from one hall to another, but finally it agreed, merely appealing to the people not to pay their taxes as a protest. These events marked the definite end of any revolutionary prospect for Germany. In response to the new situation, there was a sharp change in the content and editorial policies of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. Much less space was given to purely political questions and more to problems of direct concern to the working class. The notion of class struggle was much more to the fore, and the whole tone became more radical. Owing to the depletion in the paper's staff, Marx wrote more of the articles himself. He appears to have believed, for a moment at least, in the possible success of an armed uprising. On November 1 the paper carried an appeal, inserted independently of the editorial board, for arms and volunteers for Vienna. On November 6 Marx himself announced the fall of Vienna to a somber meeting of the Workers' Association and laid the blame for Windisgratz's victory on the manifold treachery of the Viennese bourgeoisie. He elaborated this accusation in the article, Victory of the Counter-Revolution in Vienna, published in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung on November 7. The article ended. Granted that the counter-revolution is alive throughout Europe thanks to weapons, it will die throughout Europe thanks to money. The destiny that will abolish victory is European bankruptcy, state bankruptcy. Bayonet tips break on economic points like dry tinder, the useless butcheries of the June and October days, the wearisome feast of victims since February and March. The cannibalism of the counter-revolution will itself convince the people that there is only one means to shorten, simplify, and concentrate the death agony of the old society in the bloody birth pangs of the new. One means only revolutionary terrorism. And when it seemed that the Civil Guard in Berlin might refuse to surrender their weapons and support the assembly, Marx proclaimed, "It is the duty of the Rhine province to hasten to the aid of the Berlin National Assembly with men in arms." On November 18, the Committee of Rhineland Democrats proclaimed a 3-point program signed by Marx, Schapper, and Schneider. It was published in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung and led to Marx's subsequent prosecution. The program consisted in resistance to tax collection, the organization of a popular levy for defense against the enemy, and for those without resources, weapons and munitions are to be procured at the expense of the communes and through voluntary subscription. And, thirdly, any refusal to obey the National Assembly was to be answered by the creation of committees of public safety. A People's Committee was set up in Cologne. Marx was not a member, but the feeble reactions of the Assembly precluded any recourse to arms, and tax refusal was the only point in the program that was implemented. From November 19 until mid-December, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung carried the slogan "No more taxes" underneath its masthead, and the paper devoted much space to reporting the progress of the campaign. Marx had already given the historical and economic background to this campaign a month earlier in a popular application of his materialist conceptions. After God had created the world and kings by the grace of God, he left smaller-scale industry to men. Weapons and lieutenants' uniforms are made in a profane manner, and the profane way of production cannot, like heavenly industry, create out of nothing. It needs raw materials, tools and wages, weighty things that are categorized under the modest term of production costs. These production costs are offset for the state through taxes, and taxes are offset through the nation's work. From the economic point of view, therefore, it remains an enigma how any king can give any people anything. The people must first make weapons and give them to the king in order to be able to receive them from the king. The king can only give what has already been given to him. This from the economic point of view. However, constitutional kings arise at precisely those moments when people are beginning to understand the economic mystery. Thus, the first beginnings of the fall of kings, by the grace of God, have always been questions of taxes. So too in Prussia. In spite of its vigorous campaigning, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung was getting more difficult to produce. At the end of October, Marx wrote to Engels, "I am up to my ears in work and find it impossible to do anything detailed. Moreover, the authorities do everything to steal my time." Engels had wandered through France during the month of October, compiling a delightful travel diary in which his admiration for the way of life of the French peasants was mingled with disgust at their political ignorance. Once he arrived in Switzerland, Marx kept him supplied with Munya's strange reversal of their later roles. The stupid reactionary shareholders had thought that economies would be possible now that the editorial board had shrunk. But Marx replied, "It is up to me to pay as high a fee as I wish, and thus they will get no financial advantage." He further admitted to his friend that it was perhaps not wise to have advanced such a large sum for the paper, as I have 3 or 4 press proskodians on my back and could be locked up any day, and then I could pant for money like the deer for cooling streams. But it was important to make progress under any conditions and not to give up our political position. He added that it was pure fantasy to suppose that he could have left Engels in a fix for a single moment. "You always remain my intimate friend, as I hope I do yours." Marx was much heartened by a demonstration of popular support on November 14th, when he had to appear before the public prosecutor. According to a government report, Marx was accompanied by several hundred people to the courtroom, who on his return received him with a thundering cheer and made no secret of the fact that they would have freed him by force if he had been arrested. In reply to this demonstration, Marx made a short speech, his only speech to a public meeting in Cologne, thanking the crowd for their sympathy and support. At the end of the month, he wrote optimistically to Engels, "Our paper is still conducting a policy of revolt and nevertheless steering clear of the Code Penal in spite of all the publication regulations. It is now very much in vogue. We also publish daily fly sheets." The revolution goes on. An increasing amount of Marx's time was taken up by the Workers' Association. On October 12 the delegation had asked him whether he would take over the presidency of the association, both Moll and Schopper being unavailable. Marx pointed out that his situation in Cologne was precarious, as he had not managed to obtain Prussian citizenship and was liable to prosecution for the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, but he agreed to take on the job provisionally, until the release of Dr. Gottschalk. Some modifications were introduced. Half the time at meetings was regularly given to the study of social and political questions, and from November a lengthy study of the 17 demands was begun. By December it was quite clear that the disturbances of the previous 3 months could have no revolutionary issue. On December 5 Frederick William took the decisive step of dismissing the Prussian Assembly and himself proclaiming a constitution. Marx drew his conclusions in a series of articles in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung entitled "The Bourgeoisie and the Counter-Revolution," which marked substantial revision of his earlier position. According to Marx, since the bourgeoisie had proved incapable of making its own revolution, the working class would have to rely exclusively on its own forces. "The history of the Prussian bourgeoisie," he wrote, "and that of the German bourgeoisie as a whole from March to December demonstrates that in Germany a purely bourgeois revolution and the establishment of bourgeois rule in the form of a constitutional monarchy is impossible, and that the only possibility is either a feudal absolutist counter-revolution or a social republican revolution." But Marx now despaired of the impetus for such a social republican revolution arising from inside Germany. It could only be produced by an external shock. This was the program for 1849 that he sketched out on 1 January, the liberation of Europe is dependent on a successful uprising by the French working class. But every French social upheaval necessarily founders on the English bourgeoisie, on the industrial and commercial world domination of Great Britain. Every partial social reform in France and on the European continent in general is, and remains, in as far as it aims at being definitive, an empty pious hope. And Old England will only be overthrown by a world war, which is the only thing that could provide the Chartists, the organized party of the English workers, with the conditions for a successful rising against their gigantic oppressors. The Chartists at the head of the English government. Only at that moment does the idea of a social revolution leave the realm of utopia for that of reality. But every European war which involves England is a world war. And a European war will be the first result of a successful workers' revolution in France. As in Napoleon's time, England will be at the head of the counter-revolutionary armies, but will be precipitated to the front of the revolutionary movement by the war itself and thus redeem its guilt against the revolution of the 18th century. Revolutionary uprising of the French working class, World War, that is the program for the year 1849. But however much Marx might see World War as the solution to Germany's problems, there was still the more immediate question of the elections to be held under the new constitution at the end of February. The problems of the previous May arose again, to participate or not to participate. And Marx's answer, despite his drastically changed attitude to the bourgeoisie, was still the same. When Honecker proposed in the committee meeting of January 15 that the Workers' Association put up its own candidates, the minutes record Marx as saying that the Workers' Association as such could not run any candidates at the present moment, nor was it a question for the present of maintaining certain principles, but of opposing the government, absolutism and feudal domination. And for this even simple Democrats, so-called liberals, were sufficient, as they were in any event far from satisfied with the present government. One had simply to take matters as they were. The important thing was to create as strong an opposition as possible to the present absolutist regime. It was therefore common sense, since they could not secure the victory of their own principles in the elections, to unite with another opposition party to prevent the victory of their common enemy, absolute monarchy. And, in the event, the two deputies whom Cologne sent to Berlin were both Democrats. The demise of the Neue Rheinische. During January 1849, the staff of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung was strengthened by the return of Engels, who had written from Bern to inquire of Marx whether it was safe to return. He did not mind standing trial, but what he could not support was the no-smoking rule in preventive detention. Engels devoted many of his articles to affairs in Eastern Europe, but his contributions were not entirely felicitous. He published 2 articles, one in January and the other in February, which branded, in a way reminiscent of Hegel, whole Slav peoples as reactionary and without a history. In the first of these articles, written particularly in response to Bakunin's romantically revolutionary appeals, Engels talked of the treason to the revolution of the Czechs and Southern Slavs and promised a bloody revenge on the Slavs. He finished his second article with these words: with the first successful revolt of the French proletariat, the Austrian Germans and Magyars will be free and exact a bloody revenge from the Slavic barbarians. The general war that will break out will break this Slavic union and annihilate all these small pig-headed nations right down to their very names. The next world war will cause to vanish from the face of the earth not only reactionary classes and dynasties, but also whole reactionary peoples. And that, too, is progress. This view was typical of other correspondents of the paper. The Neue Rheinische Zeitung was misled by the role that certain sections of the Slavs played in 18,489 into describing whole nations as being once and for all revolutionary or counter-revolutionary, as having a right to a history or not having a right to any history at all. During the electoral campaign, the case against Marx for his incitement during the September troubles finally came up for trial. The previous day Marx had also had to appear in court, together with Engels and Korff, who was legally responsible for the paper, to answer a charge of libel against state officials arising out of the article of the previous July protesting at the arrest of Honecker. Marx was defended by Schneider, his colleague in the Democratic Association, and also spoke lengthily himself. He defended his article by explicit reference to the Code Napoleon and by describing the subject of his article as tangible manifestation of the systematically counter-revolutionary tendency of the Hahnemann ministry and the German government in general. He went on to say that it could not be judged in isolation from the general situation in Germany and the failure of the March Revolution. He finished, "Why did the March Revolution fail? It reformed the political summit and left untouched all the foundations of this summit: the old bureaucracy, the old army, the old courts, the old judges born, educated and grown gray in the service of absolutism. The first duty of the press is now to undermine all the foundations of the present political situation." His speech was greeted with applause and all 3 defendants were acquitted. The trial on the following day was a more serious affair. Marx, Schopper and Schneider, as signatories of the anti-tax proclamation of the Rhineland Democratic Committee, were accused of plotting to overthrow the regime. Marx again defended himself in a speech lasting almost an hour. He professed amazement at being prosecuted under laws that the government itself had abrogated by its dissolution of the Assembly on December 5. Furthermore, these laws were those passed by the pre-Marx Diet, which was an outdated institution. Marx then gave the jurors an object lesson on the materialist conception of history. Society is not based on the law, he stated. That is a legal fiction. Rather, law must be based on society. It must be the expression of society's common interests and needs, as they arise from the various material methods of production, against the arbitrariness of the single individual. The Code Napoleon, which I have in my hand, did not produce modern bourgeois society. Bourgeois society, as it arose in the 18th century and developed in the 19th, merely finds its legal expression in the code. As soon as it no longer corresponds to social relationships, it is worth no more than the paper it is written on. You cannot make old laws the foundation of a new social development any more than these old laws created the old social conditions. Any attempted assertion of the eternal validity of laws continually clashes with present needs. It prevents commerce and industry, and paves the way for social crises that break out with political revolutions. Marx went on to explain that in this context the National Assembly represented modern bourgeois society against the feudal society of the United Diet, and as such was incapable of coming to terms with the monarchy. Moreover, the Assembly merely derived its rights from the people, and if the Crown makes a counter-revolution, then the people rightly answers with a revolution. Marx concluded with a prophecy: whatever way the new National Assembly may go, the necessary result can only be a complete victory of the counter-revolution or a fresh and successful revolution. Perhaps the victory of the revolution is only possible after a complete counter-revolution. The 3 defendants were again acquitted, and the foreman of the sympathetic jury thanked Marx for his instructive explanation. Marx's 2 speeches in his defense appeared shortly afterwards as a pamphlet. One result of the February election was to provoke in the Workers' Association the serious split that had been imminent for some time. Gottschalk had eventually been acquitted and released from prison just before Christmas. He found the Workers' Association much changed since July, and realizing that it was impossible for him to be re-elected president on his own terms, he left Cologne of his own accord and went to Brussels. But he still continued to follow the affairs of the association with interest and expressed his views through the association's newspaper, whose editor, Prinz, was a close friend. Prinz launched a violent attack on the Democrats, and the committee meeting next day, January 15, decided to appoint a commission to supervise Prinz in his editorial activities. But Prinz would not be supervised, and the association was obliged to found a rival journal. On the proposal of Schopper, the organization of the association was tightened up in order that disunity should not arise through lack of rules. Schopper himself became president. Marx did not hold any official position, though he and Engels offered to give the members fortnightly lectures on social questions. At the end of February, Gottschalk himself launched a violent attack on Marx in an unsigned article in Prinz's newspaper. Gottschalk took particular exception to an article by Marx in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung in which he had defended his position on the forthcoming elections. Marx had written, "We are certainly the last to desire the rule of the bourgeoisie. But our cry to the workers and petty bourgeoisie is, you should prefer to suffer in modern bourgeois society, whose industry creates the material condition for a new society that will free you all, rather than return to an obsolete form of society which, under the pretense of saving your classes, precipitates the whole nation into medieval barbarism." This did, in fact, seem to mark a change from the stark choice between social republican revolution and feudal reaction that Marx had proclaimed in December. Gottschalk was quick to attack this modified position in an unsigned open letter to Karl Marx, which was typical of many attacks on Marx from the lefty during and after the 1848 revolution. Why should we make a revolution? Why should we, men of the proletariat, spill our blood? Should we really, as you, Mr. Preacher, proclaim to us, escape the hell of the Middle Ages by precipitating ourselves voluntarily into the purgatory of decrepit capitalist rule in order to arrive at the cloudy heaven of your communist credo? You are not serious about the liberation of the oppressed. For you, the misery of the worker, the hunger of the poor has only a scientific and doctrinaire interest. You are elevated above such miseries and merely shine down upon the parties as a learned sun god. You are not affected by what moves the heart of man. You have no belief in the cause that you pretend to represent. Yes, although every day you prune the revolution according to the pattern of accomplished facts, although you have a communist credo, you do not believe in the revolt of the working people whose rising flood is already beginning to prepare the downfall of capitalism, you do not believe in the permanence of the revolution, you do not even believe in the innate capacity for revolution, and now that we, the Revolutionary Party, have realized that we can expect nothing from any class except our own. And thus our only task is to make the revolution permanent. Now you recommend to us people who are known to be weaklings and non-entities. Such was the tenor of Gottschalk's onslaught, echoing the previous views of Weitling. Marx did not reply to this attack, of which the majority of the association disapproved. Gottschalk returned to Cologne in the summer but died of cholera in September while coping with an epidemic in the poor quarters of the city. It was not only Gottschalk who considered that Marx's policies were not radical enough. Moll and Schopper had never really approved of Marx's unilateral dissolution of the Communist League, and the branches outside Germany had continued to lead a, rather shadowy, existence. On his flight from Cologne in September, Moll had settled in London and reinvigorated the group there. It was decided to re-establish the League on a wider basis. A new central committee comprising Moll, Heinrich Bauer and Icarius was elected, and Schopper was invited to found a group in Cologne even without Marx's agreement. Schopper called a meeting of selected persons to whom he suggested that, after the events of December 1848, the existence of the Communist League was once again a necessity. This meeting proved inconclusive, and shortly afterwards Moll appeared in Cologne with the specific object of winning over Marx and Engels. A meeting was held on the premises of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, at which Marx resolutely opposed the idea. Firstly, he maintained that the relative freedom of speech and press that still obtained rendered the League superfluous. He was further opposed to its recreation since a single, indivisible republic was proclaimed as the goal to be achieved, and this made the proposed League statutes more socialist than communist, and also since the statutes had a conspiratorial tendency. The meeting agreed to disagree, and Moll continued his trip to other German towns but with little success. Meanwhile, pressure on the Neue Rheinische Zeitung mounted. Marx's paper and Marx himself came in for attention from the military as well as the civil authorities. On March 2, two NCOS called on Marx in his home to ask for the name of the author of an article reporting on the conviction of an officer for the illicit sale of army material. Marx described the encounter in a subsequent letter of complaint to the Cologne commandant. I answered the gentleman, 1. That the article had nothing to do with me as it was an insertion in the non-editorial part of the paper. 2. That they could be provided with free space for a counterstatement. 3. That it was open to them to seek satisfaction in the courts. When the gentleman pointed out that the whole of the 8th Company felt itself slandered by the article, then I replied that only the signatures of the whole of the 8th Company could convince me of the correctness of this statement, which was, in any case, irrelevant. The NCOS then told me that if I did not name the man, if I did not hand him over, they could no longer hold their people back, and it would turn out badly. I answered that the gentleman's threats and intimidation would achieve absolutely nothing with me. They then left, muttering under their breath. Engels, in a much later letter, made it plain that it was not only Marx's bitter irony that made the soldiers leave so fast. Marx received them wearing a dressing gown in whose pocket he had placed an unloaded pistol with the handle showing. The sight of this was enough to make the NCOS stop asking for any further explanation. In spite of the saber bayonets with which they were armed, they lost their self-possession and departed. Engels also recounted later that many wondered how we were able to conduct our business so unhampered in a Prussian fortress of the first rank in face of a garrison of 8,000 men and right opposite the main guard post. But the 8 bayonets and the 250 sharp cartridges in the editorial room and the red Jacobin hats of the typesetters made our building also look like a fortress to the officers, and one that could not be taken by any mere surprise attack. But the days of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung were evidently numbered. 1 month before the end, Marx took the most dramatic step of his year in Cologne. He broke the ties with the Democrats that he had, till then, been so eager to foster. On April 15, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung carried the brief announcement, signed by Marx, Schopper, Honecker, Becker and Wolff: "We consider that the present organization of democratic associations contains too many heterogeneous elements to allow of an activity profitable to the aims of the cause. We are rather of the opinion that a closer connection between workers' associations is preferable as their composition is homogeneous. Therefore, as from today, we are resigning from the Rhineland Committee of Democratic Associations." The reasons for Marx's decision were probably complex. The Democratic Association had debated at length the question whether it should change its title to Democratic and Republican Association. but it had rejected the proposals and had in consequence been bitterly attacked by Anneka's Neue Kölnische Zeitung. Probably also the refounding of the Communist League and criticism from within the Workers' Association of his temporizing attitude led Marx to break with the Democrats. The content of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung had been reaching towards this left turn for some time. In March, Wolff had started a series of articles on the misery of the Silesian peasantry, and on April 5 Marx began to publish the lectures that he had given 2 years before to the German Workers' Association in Brussels on wage labor and capital. The articles were prefaced with a reference to the reproach addressed to the paper from various quarters of No T having presented the economic relations which constitute the material foundation of the present class struggle and national struggles. 3 days before Marx left the Democratic Association, the Cologne Workers' Association had invited all the Rhineland Workers' Associations to unite on a regional basis. On April 16 the General Assembly decided to cease cooperating with democratic associations in the Rhineland. And on April 26 the leaders of the Workers' Association summoned a Congress of the Workers' Associations of the Rhineland and Westphalia to meet in Cologne on May 6. One of the tasks of this Congress was to elect delegates to attend the All-German Workers' Congress in Leipzig the following month. This Congress was called by the Verbreiterung, Brotherhood, the only national workers' organization in Germany. This change of tactics further weakened the Cologne Workers' Association. A section of the members resigned and sent a letter to Gottschalk asking him to return, saying that recent policy changes only showed that the present leaders of the association were not, and are not, clear as to what they want. All this, however, happened in Marx's absence. For the past 2 months the Neue Rheinische Zeitung had been perpetually on the verge of bankruptcy. Immediately on resigning from the Democratic Association, Marx went on a 3-week trip through northwest Germany and Westphalia to collect money for the newspaper and also, no doubt, in view of the policies just adopted, to make contacts with workers' groups. He spent a fortnight in a first-class hotel in Hamburg laying plans for further communist activity with Karl von Brunn and Konrad Schramm, both members of the Communist League. While Marx was in Hamburg, revolution broke out in Germany for the last time for many years. The Frankfurt Assembly had at length drafted a constitution, but the king was in a strong enough position to reject it and coined at this time the famous phrase, "Against Democrats, the only remedy is soldiers." In early May, street fighting broke out in Dresden and lasted for a week with such colorful figures as Bakunin and the young Richard Wagner behind the barricades. There were also short-lived revolts in the Ruhr, but it was only in Baden that there was any extensive insurgency. The renewed confidence of the authorities led to the expulsion of Marx. The military authorities in Cologne had already in March applied to the police for his expulsion. The request had gone so far as Manschafel, the Minister of the Interior, but was not immediately implemented as the civil authorities in Cologne thought it would be unduly provocative to expel Marx without any particular reason. By May, however, they felt strong enough to do just that. On his return to Cologne on May 9, Marx learned that he was to be expelled. The authorities in Hamburg had already issued him with a passport valid for Paris only. On the 16th he received the order to leave Prussian soil within 24 hours because of his shameful violation of hospitality. All the other editors of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung were either expelled or threatened with arrest. The paper could not continue. The last number appeared on May 18, printed in red. On the first page there appeared a poem by Freiligrath, of which the first stanza ran in "O open blow, in an open fight, but with quips and with quirks they arraign me. By creeping treacherous secret blight the western Kalmucks have slain me. The fatal shaft in the dark did fly, I was struck by an ambushed knave, and here in the pride of my strength I lie, like the corpse of a rebel brave." Also on the first page was a message to the workers of Cologne from the editors which warned them against any attempt at a putsch in Cologne and finished, "The last word of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung will always and everywhere be emancipation of the working class." Marx himself contributed a defiant article claiming rather implausibly that the paper had always been revolutionary and had made no attempt to conceal its views. "Of what use are your hypocritical phrases that strain after impossible subterfuges? We also are ruthless and we ask for no consideration from you. When our turn comes we will not excuse our terrorism. But royal terrorists by the grace of God and the law, are brutal, contemptible and vulgar in their practice, cowardly, secretive and double-faced in their theory, and in both respects entirely without honor. 20,000 copies of the red number were sold and were soon changing hands at 10 times the original price. It was even rumored that some copies had been expensively framed to serve as icons. Marx was left with the task of winding up the affairs of the paper. All the plant and machinery which belonged to Marx personally had to be sold to pay the various debts to shareholders, employees, and contributors. Marx later claimed to have sunk 7,000 thalers of his own money in the paper. The circulation of the paper at the time of its demise was almost 6,000, but its growth had merely increased the expenses without a corresponding increase in revenue. Everything that remained, including incoming articles, Marx gave over to the Neue Kölnische Zeitung. This left them only Jenny's silver. This was packed in a suitcase lent by one of Marx's creditors, and the whole family left Cologne on May 19, 1849 and went down the Rhine to Bingen, where Jenny stayed with friends for a few days. Marx and Engels went on to Frankfurt where, assisted by Wilhelm Wolff, they met the leaders of the left in the Frankfurt Assembly to persuade them to assume leadership of the revolutionary movement in southwest Germany by summoning the revolutionary forces to Frankfurt. Meanwhile, Jenny arranged, with the help of Weidmeyer, to pawn her silver in Frankfurt. She then took the children to stay with her mother in Trier for a few days. She found her mother much changed. Straitened circumstances and old age have infiltrated into a soul that is otherwise so mild and loving, the qualities of hardness and selfishness that deeply wound those near to her. But she comforted herself with amusement at the provinciality of Trier and the confidence of Marx that all the pressures that we now feel are only the sign of an imminent and even more complete victory of our views. When Marx and Engels could get no agreement from the left in Frankfurt, they went south to Baden, where they spent a week vainly urging the revolutionary leaders, who had established a provisional government, to march on Frankfurt. In Speyer, Marx encountered Willich, still enthusiastic for campaigning, and in Kaiserslautern he met Dester, who gave him a mandate on behalf of the Democratic Central Committee, of which Marx had recently been so severely critical, to liaise on their behalf with the Paris socialists. There was plainly no further role for Marx in Germany. The two friends decided to split up. Marx would go to Paris, while Engels put his talents as a bombardier at the service of the Baden revolutionaries. However, on their way back from Kaiserslautern to Bingen, they were both arrested by Hessian troops who took them to Darmstadt and Frankfurt, where they were eventually released. Marx returned to Bingen and left for Paris on June 2, accompanied by Ferdinand Wolff. Paris again, Marx arrived in Paris, where he was to spend the next 3 months, confident of an imminent revolutionary outbreak. Following the crushing victory of Louis Napoleon at the presidential election the previous December, a military autocracy was imminent. Marx settled in the Rue de Lille near Les Invalides under the pseudonym of Amarambaz. He found Paris dismal, as indeed it must inevitably have seemed compared to the previous year. In addition, a cholera epidemic was raging far and wide. Marx was nevertheless confident of an immediate uprising and set about fulfilling his mandate. On June 7th, he wrote to Engels, "A colossal eruption of the revolutionary crater was never more imminent than now in Paris. I am in touch with the whole of the revolutionary party, and in a few days will have all the revolutionary journals at my disposition." In fact, however, the situation was grim. The sporadic armed revolts in Germany were petering out, the Hungarian rebellion was crushed by Russian troops, and in Italy the French army was in the process of re-establishing papal authority. On June 11th, following a censure motion on the government proposed by Ledru Rollin and the radical Montaigne, the workers' associations proposed an armed coup d'etat by night, but the Montaigne refused, and when the latter held a peaceful demonstration themselves 2 days later, it was easily dispersed by government troops. Thus the two parties mutually paralyzed and deceived each other. The revolution was finished. At the beginning of July, Jenny and the children had joined Marx in Paris to find themselves in a state of poverty that was to become chronic. Marx enlisted Weidmeyer's help to try and persuade a lady who had promised money for the Neue Rheinische Zeitung to give it to Marx personally so that he could purchase the copyright of The Poverty of Philosophy and make some money from a second edition. If help does not come from some quarter, he wrote to Weidmeyer, "I am lost. The last jewels of my wife have already gone to the pawnshop." Marx also wrote to Lassalle, who responded promptly and generously, but he bitterly regretted his request when he learned from Freiligrath that Lassalle had made the affair the talk of the taverns. On July 19th, however, as Jenny wrote, the familiar police sergeant came again and informed us that Karl Marx and his wife had to leave Paris within 24 hours. Marx was given the alternative of moving to the Morbihan district of Brittany. He described the area rather ungenerously as the Pontine Marshes of Brittany, and the whole proposition was a disguised attempt at murder. He managed at least to obtain a delay by appealing to the Ministry of the Interior and writing to the press that he had come to Paris with the general aim of adding to source material for my work on the history of political economy that I began 5 years ago. Marx still declared himself satisfied with the political situation. Things progress well, he wrote, and the Waterloo that the official Democratic Party has experienced is to be treated as a victory. He asked Weidmeier to try to persuade Lesk, despite the still outstanding debt, to publish his articles on wage labor and capital. He had already put out feelers to Berlin in the hope of establishing a monthly on economics and politics. On August 17, Marx wrote to Engels that the increasingly reactionary nature of the French government gave hope for an immediate revolutionary insurrection. We must start a literary and commercial enterprise. I await your propositions. A week later, he sailed for England. London. One comes to see increasingly that the emigration must turn everyone into a fool, an ass, and a common knave unless he contrives to get completely away from it. The first year in London. Nothing, it has been said, endures like the temporary. When Marx came to England, certainly he had no idea that he would make it his permanent home. For years he shared the view of most of his fellow refugees that a new round of revolutions would soon break out on the continent. Like the early Christians awaiting the Second Coming, they regarded their present life as of little importance compared to the great event that was to come. This partly accounts for the ad hoc nature of much of Marx's life during what was in fact to be a long and sleepless night of exile. Leaving Jenny and the children behind in Paris, Marx crossed the Channel on August 24, 1849, in the company of the Swiss communist Seiler and Karl Blind, a young Democrat from Baden. Probably on his arrival in London he temporarily stayed in Karl Blind's lodgings above a coffeehouse in Grosvenor Square. This, anyway, was the address he used for correspondence. His prospects were bleak. "I am in a really difficult position," he wrote soon after his arrival. "My wife's pregnancy is far advanced. She must leave Paris by September 15th, and I don't know where I am to rake together the necessary money for her travel and our settling here." Jenny had difficulty extending her visa even to September 15th, when the lease on their Paris house expired, and arrived in London on the 17th with her 3 small children and the birth of her 4th less than 3 weeks away. She was met by George Worth, a wholesaler trader who was one of the founder members of the Communist League and had worked on the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. He found them a furnished room in a Leicester Square boarding house which they soon left, moving to a 2-roomed flat in the fashionable area off the King's Road in Chelsea. The rent was high, about £6 a month, but their own meager resources were supplemented by money from Jenny's mother, and they managed for the time being. On November 5th, Jenny wrote in her memoirs, while the people outside were shouting "Guy Fawkes forever" and small-masked boys were riding the streets on cleverly made donkeys and all was in an uproar, my poor little Heinrich was born. We call him Little Fawkes in honor of the great conspirator. Thus, as Worth remarked, Marx had 4 nations in his family, each of his children having been born in a different country.